Today, I'm going to be talking about social science, specifically measurement. Software testing is a social science, so I think we need to go back and study the origins of where we came from in order to move on past this sort of perpetual youth that we've been stuck in as a craft, sort of a Peter Pan syndrome. So I'm going to talk about a paradigm shift in measurement that occurred between the late 1800s and the early 1900s, and how that's affected us as an industry.
Sorry.
Okay, better? Okay, so I'm going to talk about a paradigm shift in measurement, how that's affected us as an industry, and some practical ways we can move on from there. So toward the late 1800s, most measurement that was done for experimental research in psychology was qualitative in nature. And by this, I mean that researchers would collect a group of subjects, engage them in some sort of topic, and record it as a conversation. And this was usually done via text or audio. After all the data was collected, the conversation would be sliced up into categories. So the researcher was basically making inferences about what a person meant. After this, they would take all of this conversations and the categories and count the number of things that were approximately equivalent. So people were, this is how qualitative measurement came to be. It was counting equivalence classes in conversation. An important thing to note is that the form of the data was not pre-existing. The form was applied by somebody that was making interpretations about something that somebody else said. So around the early 1900s, there was a shift in how this research data was being taken. It was moved to something that was more qualitative in nature, meaning that people were just counting things that they thought existed. They weren't recording it as a story. So the idea was that they could count these things because they were socially ingrained in our society. Like, I can count the number of chairs in this room because everybody agrees on what a chair is. It's taken for granted. Nobody questions it. So I'm going to take this discussion and frame it around a couple of experiments. The first one I want to talk about is a threshold discrimination test. So what the researcher would do is take a set of calipers and apply it to a subject's skin. And this idea was that the subject would respond with either 1 or 2, depending on how many points they felt. The person who actually coined this, or created this experiment, and coined the term psychophysics, which is the measurement of human response to physical stimulus, his name was Gustav Fechner. So he created the experiment with the idea that the extremely limited possible results would create a qualitative measurement. According to the method of this experiment, the subjects could only respond with 2 possible answers, either 1 or 2. But he discovered, much like we discover in testing, that people are extremely bad at following methods. His subjects struggled to reply with those 2 answers. They had a tendency to respond with something that was between oneness and two-ness whenever there was ambiguity. So if they didn't quite understand what they were feeling, sometimes they would say the stimulus felt broad or thick or dumbbell-shaped, but not necessarily 1 or 2. One other interesting thing he noted is that subjects improved their ability to predict the stimulus through practice. So he would give this in repetition, and initially people were very bad at it. But after 20 or so repetitions, people improved in their ability to discern whether they were sensing 1 or 2. The next person that ran this experiment, his name was Alfred Binet. He was not a psychophysicist. Alfred Binet's main focus of study was developmental psychology, specifically in children. So he initially ran this test on his young daughter, Madeline, and Binet found what Titchner already knew, which is that people are not good at following method. So Madeline responded occasionally with 1 or 2, but frequently she would provide answers that was somewhere in between. So Binet scaled up this running of the test, this performance, and eventually opened it up to sets of adult subjects. And he allowed them to freely report on their experience rather than follow the method. So he had hundreds of adult subjects, and they would respond with many different categories. So he introduced this qualitative complexity to something that was supposed to be explicitly quantitative. So people were essentially telling a story about what they were sensing. And because of this, the body of psychologists that were out there that were doing this study stopped taking it seriously. It made it too complex. There was no agreement about what the right number of categories were. There was no agreement about what good categories were. Titchner ran this in an island set between the north of Australia and Papua New Guinea called the Torres Straits. He found there what we often experience is that people tend to game systems when they don't make sense. So the islanders actually did follow the method to some degree. They responded 1 or 2 for every single repetition of the test. But the researchers later discovered that the islanders were trying to impress the researchers with their ability to predict 1 or 2. So there was no actual understanding of what they were measuring. This quote is from an unfortunately named man, Edwin Boring. The meaning of the judgment, too, is indeterminate unless a criterion has been established. There was no actual understanding of what they were measuring. 1 or 2 wasn't a concrete thing. It was about what the subjects were feeling and sensing in the cultural or the social surroundings, and then also what the researchers were interpreting. So this experiment suffered from severe problems of reliability and validity. Reliability is the ability to consistently repeat results in a test if you're performing it several times over a period of time. Validity is how well the number represents the thing you're measuring. In software testing, something we deal with quite frequently is called construct validity, which is the extent to which the number represents the theory you're trying to measure. So in this previous experiment, the number didn't actually represent human response to sensory stimulus because it was being interpreted at several different layers. W.H. Winch was concerned with an entirely different style of problem. He was not an experimental researcher, he was an applied psychologist. He was focusing on the problem of how kids respond to experimental classroom settings. He was trying to improve the efficiency of education. So what he would do is expose children to a series of experimental settings, then test them all in the same way, and the idea was that he could get some semblance of how people respond based on the testing. But he was taking pools and pools of data and averaging it all together, and the idea was that the regularities in the data would allow him to make assumptions about a group of people. Charles Spearman was a very big critic of Winch's work. Immediately spotted that the patterns of data don't actually represent how individuals perform. So you have it has a tendency of washing out extremes in data or black swans. So somebody that performs very, very well in one area would not be seen. I think we see this a lot in test data because we often try to model when we'll be done testing based on what's happened in the past. So this is about 50 years of leading up to only qualitative research in experimental psychology. that caused two big things. One, an extreme growth of statistical analysis as a field of study and as a career. And also it forced people that did not fit into this method of thinking outside of mainstream publication. So if you were not studying and writing about quantitative measurement, you were not going to get published in mainstream psychological publications. Yeah, I forgot to say one thing. Edwin Boring was also concerned that people were extremely focused on studying a constructed statistical reality instead of the actual psychological reality they were supposed to be investing their time in. So this is what we're left with as an industry right now. All of these have problems. I'm sure you can think of many more examples of measurements that you're expected to give to other people daily that don't actually mean anything. So how do we get past this? I think we can find, if we're talking about one specific area of measurement that we do in software, I think we can begin to approach a problem. And I think that area is in capacity and flow and performance. And what I mean by flow is the rate at which work moves through a system. If we're talking about measuring quality, I think that answer is far more complex, and it's not going to be solved through numbers, and it's probably another conference talk. So what is lean? Post-World War II Japan, the Toyota factory was making textiles at the time. They had to retool in order to help rebuild a country. So they developed a strategy for efficiency and improvement that would help them come up to speed fast enough to be able to actually accomplish this goal. So it's a strategy for improvement. It's not a set of tools or methods. It's a philosophy. One thing this actually focuses on is returning to the qualitative nature of management. Rather than producing reports, management actually comes down to the floor and observes the work directly. So they understand what's happening because they've been seeing it over periods of time. There is a concept in Lean that comes from the Japanese language called the gemba. The gemba is the place where the work happens. If you watch Japanese news in the evening and there's a crime scene, they'll say they're reporting from the gemba. It's where the thing happened. And that's where the manager goes. So Taiichi Ohno is one of the creators of TPS, which was eventually modified into Lean. He created a framework of 7 wastes to help us think about places we can improve, become more efficient. So I like to use this acronym because it's easy to remember. Now time, which is non-quality product, overproduction, waiting, transportation, inventory, motion, and excess processing. So each of these represents something that was originally intended as a wasteful area in manufacturing, but we have modified them so that they're representative of stuff we see in software. So non-quality is preventable, predictable defects. Overproduction is producing lots of low-value features, some of which your customer may never even touch. Waiting is the time you spend doing nothing because you have to wait for somebody else to do something in order for you to get the work that you need to do. Transportation is long deploy cycles. In the manufacturing world, this was often thought of as any long movement of product where a defect could potentially be inserted. Inventory is large amounts of work in progress. Motion is complicated development environments or repeated data entry, things that require you to do lots of work. Excess processing is producing software well beyond the quality threshold that your customer requires. So I actually have a concrete example of how I've used this framework. I was working with a client recently and came in on the first week, And I was sort of asking probing questions to discover how they were doing work. So this client was doing 2-week sprints at the time, and the test group was getting their first test build of the product maybe on the 2nd or 3rd day of week 2, expecting that all of the work would be done by that Friday. So that was a very obvious thing that was wrong. That's people waiting, that's non-quality product because there's a huge buildup of potential bugs that nobody knows about. People are coding on top of it, possibly inserting new bugs. That's transportation because no build is happening for a third or for 2/3 of the release cycle. So I focused on these specific things. The first thing I did with this client was work with the developer and the ops person. So we had 8 or 9 different repos. Each of them were originally getting tagged independently, so they were all working on different versions. Then there was a step to package everything. Then it had to be pushed up to AWS or EC2 servers. And then we had to run puppet configs. All of these were manual steps. Getting the build took over an hour just to produce one test build. So what we did was script all of that. It was layers of scripting for each thing. And then there was a script that did it all. So to deploy a build, it took about 3 weeks to do this, but to deploy a build at the end of this took 5 minutes. So 1 hour to 5 minutes, just focusing on the wastes that were there. I didn't have to measure anything to do this, by the way. So if you absolutely must measure something and report it up in terms of flow and capacity, I think that these are a pretty good place to start. I don't recommend measuring them for long periods of time. This is about inquiry, not control. The idea is that you can discover where you currently are in order to figure out ways to improve. So work in progress is the amount of things you're currently doing. If you are working on more than one thing at a time, you're going to go slower. It's just math. You can't do 2 things in the same amount of times that you would do one. Cycle time is the amount of time you would spend working on a product from the time you start till the time it's in production. Lead time is the amount of time it takes from a funded customer request to getting into production. Touch time is the amount of time you spend doing value-added work on a project, so you are actually hands on the keyboard working, doing things that help the project. Slack is the amount of time you are not working currently. So this sounds bad. Western culture demonizes idleness, right? But Slack gives you the ability to sharpen your tools to some degree, and it also gives you spare time to respond to emergencies, which in software inevitably happen. So you want to have some amount of spare time. Tact is a German concept for an American-named philosophy of a Japanese thing. It's kind of weird. It's layered. Tact is the pace of customer demand. So if your customer is demanding 6 new things per week, and you're only delivering 4, then you're not matching what your customer wants. Time slicing is the amount of time you spend jumping between projects. So if you're only working on one thing at a time, that's called one-piece flow. Variation is the size difference in things you're working on, and the idea behind that is if you reduce the variation, then you'll have a better idea of what you've worked on historically, and this will give you plus or minus a little bit of an idea of what you might be doing in the future. And the find, fix, test, retest loop is often known as churn or failure demand. And this is how much time you spend going back and forth because things don't work. So Lean is not about specific tools. It's not a Kanban board. It's not whatever other tools immediately come to mind. It's a philosophy of improvement. So in this book, This is Lean, there's a story at the end that the author's telling that I thought was striking. So the author is an operational researcher at a university, but he also has a day job at a factory in Sweden. So he invites a Lean consultant, a Toyota Production Systems consultant, to his factory. They're walking around, they're on the shop floor where they clearly should be observing the work. And he's sort of going to each station and framing it around the waist, saying, look how tidy this workstation is, aren't we lean yet? Look how little work in progress we have, aren't we lean? And the consultant would sort of scratch his chin and just say, that's very interesting. So they went through the whole factory and observed all the workstations and framed it around wastes and things like that, things that a lean consultant would do. And then when they got back, they wanted a final report. So once again, the author asked the consultant if they were lean. He wanted to know if they had gotten there. Were they at the mountaintop? And the consultant replied, I couldn't possibly know that because I wasn't here yesterday. So I think that's a great representation of what lean is about and what measurement is about. It's about finding where you are right now so you can tell what you could possibly improve on and how you've improved from yesterday or last week or last month. It's not about your current state, and it's not about controlling process. So that's it. Thank you.
Okay, people, green cards. Where's the question? Don't be that shy. You don't have your cards with you.
Okay. Thomas Vaniotis. I'm a little curious about the cultural aspects of introducing these kinds of measurements, specifically the sort of the lean, the things that you listed as things that you measure to examine and find these wastes, because I think that can be threatening to people who aren't accustomed to being measured in that way. So I'm just curious about your experiences as a consultant and
Sure.
just your thought about how to deal with that psychological aspect.
Sure. Okay.
I just want to understand and be clear about Thomas's question. I think he might be asking, there's waste in the system that is bad, and people are afraid of getting caught. And how do you deal with that cycle? Or maybe caught is judgmental, but they're afraid of reality being made visible, or something like that, or the political implications of that, or something like that. I just thought there's something in there I thought was worth mentioning before you answered, right?
That's a fine clarification to my question.
Okay. So I'm not quite sure how to answer that now, but I'll try. So this is all framed around improvement. It's not about controlling systems or controlling how people work or creating a penalization system behind not meeting metrics. It's about discovering where you are and figuring out if that's where you want to be or if you want to go further. One way I've done this in the past is through sort of quiet disobedience. You can actually create a graph of the amount of projects you're working on at a given time and show that you finish things faster when you're working on less. You could post it up on your cubicle wall and people will notice it as they walk by. It's not actually inserting the measurement into other people's space. It's not measuring other people, it's measuring yourself so people can see how this actually works. So I think that's a good way of seeding the idea that you can use this as a measurement for improvement.
Next question, 235.
So you had a couple of different slides up. You had the one that showed the metrics that we all know and hate, right? Things like lines of code, number of classes, code coverage, that sort of thing. And then you showed your context-driven measurements. What I'm noticing there, though, is there's a lack of anything in that context-driven measurement, that the qualitative or not, that's actually going to give you a summary of the quality of the code that you're shipping. Whereas in a lot of the metrics that were in there before, they were trying to measure some sort of quality or come up with some sort of a statement on the quality of the product. The context-driven measurements that you showed, there don't really seem to be anything in there. It seems more about speed and iteration loops than it is about the quality.
Right.
So how do you get to that some sort of qualitative quantity or quality measurement in the new world?
So qualitative and quantitative, these are competing measurements. You can't measure the qualities, right? You can't look at the product and count how many qualities are in it. You can send out a survey or have conversations with your users, and you can make assumptions about what they tell you and count how many people say a certain thing about your product. Like if 10 people say it's good, the first time you run this experiment, 5 people say it's good the second time you run an experiment, you might have some reduction in quality. But that doesn't imply position. 5 isn't greater than 10 if you're measuring it like this. Measuring quality is substantially more difficult than measuring quantitative things. I think that's a long discussion.
Okay, next question. I'll bring the mic to Natalie, 144.
Yeah, sorry, we're a little spread out here. I'm curious if you've got examples of good measurement in social sciences, be it besides the lean stuff, which is fascinating, but you listed a bunch of sort of examples of maybe not as effective measurement in the social sciences in the first part of the talk, and I'm curious if you've got any studies or books that come to mind of good examples of well-designed social experiments with either qualitative or quantitative measurement that actually mean something.
Sure. So I've been reading a book called Constructing the Subject by Danziger. He was a professor of psychology. Kim Kainer actually studied under him. This book is a history of psychology. It talks a lot about the different styles of measurement, and there's a lot of different case studies in there. I think you might find what you're looking for in that book. There is another book that is the predecessor, written by our fine Dr. Boring. It's called History of Experimental Psychology, I think. There are many more case studies in there. Did that answer your question? Cool.
Okay, I was just wanted to ask if people from the audience on the webcast have a question. And guess what? One is coming. But nevertheless, people all around the world watching this, please ask your questions if you have one. This one, this one is from Carlos Smith. I know him, he's from Croatia. Okay, can we, by first focusing to create wrong measurements, come to really good ones? You can read it yourself if you want. One moment.
It says, can we first focus on creating wrong measurements, come to really good ones? Potentially. I think we can, as a culture of testers, it's our tendency to iterate over ideas and discuss what we're currently doing and how we could potentially improve it. But as measurement is commonly used in practice in real companies, I struggle to see how that would happen. Most of the time, you're given a solution statement that you are to give a certain type of measurement to the people above you, and that's it. I'm struggling to think of a way to change that system, aside from doing it quietly yourself and showing people that it actually works.
Okay, next question, 132. Michael.
One thing you had on the last slide you showed was you said, I think, that sometimes you just don't need to measure. And that kind of struck me with the similarities that might exist between that and the no estimates movement you see chatter about on Twitter. Do you think there are commonalities there? And if so, can we leverage those commonalities to not measure when we don't need to?
Sure, that would most likely depend on the organization you work in. Different people are more likely to respond in different ways. But if you're explicitly looking at the things you want to improve in your organization, most of the time, I'm pretty sure you don't need a number to tell you that. You can look around and see what's not working, and you can focus on that specific thing and figure out how to make it better.
Yeah. Okay, I have one question from the audience abroad. And I know this guy very well. I visit his home quite often. Ray Oei. Justin, how would you look at measuring team happiness, which is often used in agile teams?
Measuring team happiness?
Yep, that's what he says.
I would probably just ask them how happy they were.
He cannot respond, I think. That's it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Just talk to them and ask them how happy they are. It seems, I don't know.
Okay. Luckily, Ben raised his yellow card, because people, if you have questions, please raise your green card, because my stack is a bit empty.
I was just going to comment that if half your team leaves, they're probably not happy.
I'm sorry?
If half your team leaves, they're probably not happy.
That's a great
So
metric
that
for
could be
having a
another
team that's not happy. Sure.
Metric. But yes, good thing. Ask people if they're happy.
Right. Have a conversation.
Yes, as a group and one-on-one.
Right.
I see a follow-up question. Number 218.
I just wanted to say that if half your team doesn't leave, if your team stays, that doesn't necessarily show that they're happy.
That's also true.
That's it.
No questions? Oh, wait, whoa. I have a yellow one and a green one. First go to the yellow one. Write the first down. 144, Natalie.
Just on this subject of direct measurements, I had a boss who occasionally would ask me for numbers, you know, bug reports, whatever. He wanted metrics. Was never super serious about it. I considered at one point counting the number of times that he said the software sucked, because my general observation was that tracked pretty closely to, you know, whether or not it actually did suck. And I actually considered at one point just writing that down and putting it in an Excel spreadsheet for him, because it was like, you kind of already know like what the quality level is in your software.
That can be useful qualitative measurement, actually. I forgot who coined this, but somebody out on the inner tubes said that you can measure quality in WTFs per minute.
Yeah, yeah. So then I guess we're getting back to the writing down things people said in conversations.
Okay, thank you. 104. New thread.
You mentioned that sometimes you need to stop measuring. I found that this is something that is difficult to do, because once management starts to like a metric, they really, really like that metric, and they don't want to stop measuring it. Do you have an example where you convince somebody to stop measuring something and maybe move on to something else?
I have struggled with this in the past. Several companies ago, I was working for a group that was measuring nothing and doing it quite well, and it was lots of fun, and we were making software. And then the company began to grow, and they wanted to start measuring things. So we were measuring a lot of this type of stuff. So I tried to make the argument about traditional measurement problems, reliability, validity, things like this. Unfortunately, that's a terrible conversation to have with management, because they just don't care. What they want is information. I eventually left that organization because I was unable to convince them, and for other reasons. Communicating things like that as a culture of testing, I think, is something that we need to learn how to do. I don't yet know how to do that.
Okay. Yeah, the red card. Was it yellow or blue? Okay, yellow. Same thread.
So going back to what you were saying, by the way, my name is Jonathan. Just because management likes a certain metric doesn't mean it's a good thing, and I think it's easy to show them that it's not a good thing. Many companies I've noticed started liking, oh, number of bug counts, that's going to show, or number of P1 or P2 bug counts is going to show how good a product is. And then you start having people fight between each other. Oh, is this a P1, is this a P2? Just to get your numbers up, and some people are paid, or bonuses are paid based, oh, this guy seems to log so many bugs, he must be a great tester, right? And then you get people, like I said, just people fighting and just wasting their time between developers and testers, or just between testers themselves, trying to say, is this a bug or not, and things like that. I just wanted to add that comment.
That's actually a great point. I've experienced similar things when we're doing estimation. If you're doing a point system and you're estimating and trying to figure out what the difference between something that's 30 points and something that's 31 points, you're focusing on the wrong problem. If it's that big, you just don't know what you're doing in the first place, and you need to make it smaller.
Okay, no more questions, because my stack is empty. Thank you, Natalie. Also, people in the audience abroad, if you have questions, please raise them.
Have you ever seen a situation where management got unhealthily attached to measurements like the lean measurements that are generally more positive measurements? And how can you avoid management finding ways to abuse those numbers and using them incorrectly?
Sure. So, I mean, a significant amount of the usefulness of these is in the intent, right? Not the actual procuring of the number. It's whether you want to use these to control an organization or as a method of inquiry to figure out where you are. I honestly don't know how to approach that situation in a great way. I think probably the best way is to, the phrase, think globally, act locally, focus on how you can use them to improve what you're doing. People would notice that.
No more questions? Are you really sure? Oh, okay. I tried to persuade you. 012.
Yeah. Have you measured your own work to see how much you have influenced, changed, and mental concepts?
Not in a numeric way. I tend to go with, I really, really enjoy using the framework of wastes as a way to improve, and I share that with the people I work with, and they respond to it. They see that you can actually identify specific things, and you can improve and focus on one thing at a time, and you can improve the efficiency that you're working with.
Good, thanks.
But no, I haven't produced any numbers that show that I'm actually improving.
Okay, Thomas.
So I took an organizational economics course recently, and in that course, sort of one of the things that was asserted is that a company should be organized so that performance is basically to align incentives, so that an organization's architecture is basically based on assignment of decision rights, as in who can make a decision, a performance metric system, so how can you tell if decisions were well made, and then an incentive system to reward making the right decision. So this is what they teach you in business school about how you should run an organization. So I think this metrics talk is a bit about that performance analysis, and along with it, it's not going to be effective unless, at least according to this model, it's not going to be effective unless you have a reward system that support and that the decision rights are analyzed based on that. So I guess what I'm trying to get at is people who hear this talk, who are trained as MBAs or whatever, are going to say, great, You just gave me a way to incentivize people to do the right thing. How do you respond to that?
I think that's a very sad way to do business and a sad assumption to make about human intentions and the way people generally do things. Some people just want to do good work and they enjoy what they do. I would be unhappy to see people incentivizing work based on measurement. I think that's a control structure and not exactly in the philosophy with how I see this working.
So in defense of the economists, they usually say that people feeling good about their work is a form of compensation. A non-measurable, but still a form of compensation.
Sure.
Okay, new thread, 144 again.
Are you familiar with quantified self? Because the more that we talk about this, and especially with the measuring organizations, that it seems like there's some parallels here in using numbers to explore systems, whether they're personal self or organizations.
I've heard the phrase, but it's not immediately coming to mind what it is.
You might want to. I mean, quantified self is it's a blog basically that serves as an aggregator for.
Can you tweet that to me?
Yes, I will.
Awesome.
But it's people doing experiments on themselves with numbers.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
No more questions? Really? Okay. Green one. 171. Thank you.
Uriel from Primero Brew Costs in Seattle. We actually use a lot of the lean principles. It really started out at the claims processor level, where they were trying to figure out where all the waste was in getting through call volume, right? So people would phone in, there was claims issues, and the takt time and the cycle times, they were monitoring that. And so they found a lot of improvements to that. And then we started adopting it in the IT realm, where we were looking for waste as well. We're still kind of experimenting with that, right? So there's a few RPIWs that are going on and trying to figure out, for example.
What's an RPIW?
It's a lean term. Not rapid process improvement workflow or something like that. And so we do a lot of those events, and we use Kanban boards in IT, those kind of things. But one of the things that we were working on recently was reducing the cycle time between the time the work comes in the queue for IT to work on, and figuring out where we're wasting time, right? So customers don't want to wait for features. So we have a work intake problem that we're trying to fix. So that's kind of a real world example of how we're using it.
Awesome. Thank you.